Hello, everybody. Welcome tonight. We have some special guests with us here tonight. It's the first time that Grant has been on camera with all of his assistants together. So I'm here tonight. I'm Nicole Sackage, and we're joined with Sinead Wellahan and Desta Barnaby. And tonight we're continuing our series on ufology, art, and music. And our guest tonight is Mike Clelland. And here I'll read just a quick little bio about you, Mike, and then I'll let you take over and kind of introduce yourself as well. Mike is an avid outdoorsman, illustrator, and UFO researcher. He has written extensively on the subject of alien abductions, synchronicities, and owls. It was his firsthand experiences with these elusive events that have been the foundation for his research. So welcome, everybody, and welcome, Mike. Thanks for being here tonight.
You're very welcome.
How are you?
I'm very good. I'm very good. I'm half Canadian. My dad was born in Canada, so I'm sort of half up to speed with everything going on there. So.
Well,
Oh, did someone freeze up?
I think I'm the American here from the States. So
oh, you are from the States.
You may have to reboot, Nicole. You're breaking up.
I don't know.
Try again.
Okay, well, you take over and I'll try to reboot.
Okay. So, well, Nicole from the land of Lincoln, I always say that she may be the great granddaughter of Abraham Lincoln, but she's gone to reboot. And my name is Grant Cameron, and I'm good friends with Mike Clelland, and I wanted to bring him on because we're doing this series on art, and I know that Mike had done a lot of art, so I want to bring him on. But he has a lot of good stories. I've always said he has one of the best stories, some of the best stories I've ever heard in ufology, and he's a good storyteller. And I'll just tell one because Mike may not remember this story, but my assistant Sinead is here, and she's into numbers, and Mike is also into numbers. So I do recall, Mike, we were together in Eureka Springs, and you were giving your lecture. I think it started at 11 o'clock in the morning. And then you were finished, and you and I, your girlfriend, and I think Desta was there. I think Desta was with us.
Yeah, that's where I met Desta.
Yeah, and so we were going for lunch, and then you came off the stage, and you said, Grant, what time do you think my lecture ended? And I went, I don't know. And he went, 12:34, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we went, so we go to the restaurant, and we were in the restaurant, and then we had lunch or whatever in this beautiful restaurant at Eureka Springs. And then we came out, and I remember there was the numbers at the desk where they signed the people in. It was like 1, 2, 3, 4 on the counter. And then and then you go, look at this, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then I go, hey, that's pretty cool. Like, to me, it was like the synchronicity was just unbelievable. And then your girlfriend goes, oh, this goes on all day long. So we're gonna first do music, and then I want to get into some of your other stuff and what you're working on now and your podcast, because as I say, and I mean this seriously, I mean, you are one of the best storytellers in the business, and you're a very gentle guy that I think anybody would really latch onto and believe. So let's start with art. We're doing this thing. So is there a what we're believing, that there's a connection between UFO experiencers and people who end up being artists or musicians? We did the musicians, but now we're doing artists.
Well, the short answer is yes. I have never done like quantitative research and put it all on a big spreadsheet and tried to solve it. But one of the questions I ask when I talk to people, I have a kind of a set list of questions, beyond like, when did you see the experience the event and stuff. But one of the questions I always ask is, are you a creative type? Do you draw? Do you paint? Do you do poetry? Do you write music? And it's nearly 100%. So I'm going to be really cautious saying it's 100%, but it's pretty close. And then at the same time, someone, like maybe does something creative, but the number of people who play music or paint is pretty remarkable. And then there's also the folks that, well, Christopher Bledsoe is a good example, that just started drawing right after his contact event.
Yeah.
That's rare, but not unheard of in the field, where people will have these experiences where they'll begin drawing or painting or something like that, or music, started playing a musical instrument shortly after what would be a powerful contact event. I've been drawing since I was a little kid, and I can't say that it's directly tied in, but I've been working as an illustrator since I was 16. So that's, you know, most of my life. And I have, I went to art school, and I think, so this is, you know, I'm wondering whether the art type, the art person, the sort of the temperament of the artist would allow them to be a little more open, right? So the banker might not want to talk about it, you know, the lawyer might not want to talk about it publicly, but the artist has got nothing to lose, so they're talking about their own experiences. And so, you know, I kind of think about that and I factor that in a little bit, but I would say that so the other question I ask, which is, I think is uniquely tied in, is, you know, so one of the is, you know, before your event, after your event, how did your spirituality change? And so for me, the art and spirituality are kind of meshed together, you know, that so people will often say, oh, my spirituality totally changed. And possibly that leaves them really open to doing art. But I know a lot of painters who paint their own experiences, or, you know, that their contact experiences are kind of intertwined with their paintings. It's not so much that they're painting flying saucers, but that or aliens, but they're painting from a more altruistic or spiritual framework, if that makes sense. And so that, I'm generalizing a little bit, but I would say safely that's a real factor that shows up in the field. People who have contact events, people who abduction events would then go on to paint, or their spirituality would change. You know, paint, music, write, so all those things.
Yeah, so you attribute, like I always attribute it to the right brain, left brain thing, where artists and musicians are more sort of right brain, open, visual. So in your number of people that you've done a lot of experiencers, I think you work the same as me, is you spend a lot of time talking to experiencers. Do you get many bankers, artists, bankers and say engineers, and these sort of real left brain people, or is it mostly sort of the right brain people that you'd put in that artistic thing?
I've certainly got some, but I would have to say mostly it's people who are on the artistic end of the spectrum. So the right brain, yeah. So that's just anecdotal for me. And also, like, I'm coming from a place of exploring this creatively and exploring this as almost, you know, the stuff with all the owls and things like that. I'm pretty fringy. Like, I'm not a nuts and bolts guy. So I feel like I'm attracting, and because of that, you know, these more artistic folks are arriving in my email inbox because of that. But certainly there's a preponderance of creative types in just a sprinkling of bean counters, or whatever term you want to use.
Were you always a nuts and bolts, never a nuts and bolts guy? You were always a sort of a...
Well, I mean, you know, like, once I started looking into it, so when I started looking into my own experiences, I started reading UFO books probably when I was about 29, 30. And I really never looked into my own experiences until after I had been looking in, you know, and one of the very first series of books I read was the trilogy that Jacques Vallée put out, Confrontations, Revelations, and I can't remember the third one. There was 3 books in a series, and they really changed the way I look at it. That and Communion were like, that was like right in the first year of me reading about this stuff. So that really changed really influenced the foundation of how I look at this stuff. So I guess the answer was no, I was never a nuts and bolts guy.
One last question, then I'll maybe throw it over to Nicole or Sinead to jump in. We talked about this beforehand, and this is your list. You keep this very unique list of traits where you have the thing with the numbers, where you ask about the numbers and the mission. Can you sort of go through this list of, because what we're looking at is one particular aspect where it seems to be that a lot of experiencers have this characteristic of art, or they've got a musical background or something, but you have a whole another list. Can you go through some of the things that you sort of point out that pop up all the time when you talk to people?
Oh, did we? I just made this list up and I just ran it off the top of my head. So one of the first things I ask is, what changed, what was going on in your life leading up to the event, and what changed in your life after the event. So oftentimes that's spirituality, that's the change in the direction of their life. That'll be, oftentimes people have healing. So one of the questions I ask is healing abilities. Do you have you been healed, or do you have like hands-on healing abilities? And when I do, I usually I take notes. I don't really take that many notes when I talk to someone on the phone, but I'll write in the corner of the page, I'll write Reiki, and I'll just wait. And it's soon as like someone will say, "So what are you doing for work these days?" And they're like, "Oh, I'm a Reiki therapist, or I'm a Reiki master." And it's not 100%, but it is so close to 100% that it's beyond chance. I mean, it is nearly everyone I talk to who has like an owl and UFO. So my focus has been this owl stuff. So the people who end up finding me are the people who have had owl experiences. The Reiki thing, doing hands-on Reiki healing is near 100% of the people I talk to somehow do that, which is bizarre. That's certainly not 100% of the population doing Reiki healing, but it's
I think Ray Hernandez, I think, also said the same thing. He said, if I had $1 for every Reiki healer I run into, I'd be a rich guy.
Yeah, exactly. So the field is full of these people who have this hands-on healing ability. So this healing aspect is part of it. And then creativity. Have you ever had a near-death experience? Are you psychic? What your connection to the environment? So those are the questions I'm asking. Are you looking for one in particular? Because I'm doing that list off the top of my head.
Yeah, well, you had the one with the number where you ask about the
oh yeah. So I ask if everyone has that number, and this is really so like you go to a UFO conference and you can just turn to someone and like, what's your number? And they'll say, oh, my number's 333. And the person next to them will say, I'm 1111. And then I asked that of Daryl Anka, the guy who channels Bashar, and he just said 1010. So everyone's got their, and sometimes they're really like, some people are like, oh, I'm 444. And it's so everyone seems to have like their little synchronistic number that plagues them or follows them around. So
and yours is 1234, right? You've got a couple numbers, right?
Oh, if I get 123 is easy. Like you can get 123. If you get 1234, that's a little. If I get 12345, that's like a showstopper for me. If like that shows up some places, that's just that. So there was this is a little bit of a long story, but I was this is in my third book where I talk about this. There was a woman named Megan, and there was and we had talked a lot, and I'm going to be very cautious saying this because she hasn't said it outright, but she certainly has the kinds of experiences, memories that someone who has had UFO contact would talk about. So I'm not going to go any farther than that. So, and I was watching there's a movie called Catfish, which is a fake documentary. It came out about 2013 or something like that. And it was it's actually quite a good movie, but it was like a mock documentary. And at the end of the documentary is this story about a guy who falls in love with a woman named Megan, but he realizes that she's a fake character. Like someone just invented her and just pretended to be this person on Facebook. And it's actually kind of an interesting, engaging story. But at the very end of the movie, there's like a freeze frame, and it basically says, Megan never existed. Something to that effect. And my DVD player, back when people used those things, DVD player froze up at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And it was as I was typing a message to this woman, Megan, who's had some, let's say, some very powerful, unusual experiences. And it and I tried it over. I stopped the VCR and I played back again. It would freeze up over and over again at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1 hour, 23 minutes, 45 seconds. And it was Megan. Her name was right there on the screen. And I was just started texting with her at that second. And I basically was like, oh my gosh, is she a real person? Is this like anyway, I ended up contacting her brother. I didn't say it outright, but I was kind of like checking to see if like, what's going on with this? So, I have contact experiences. This woman, Megan, I'll cautiously say, has some powerful experiences in her life. And I get this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 synchronicity, like at the second I'm trying to reach her. So these are the things that are, some of these stories are so difficult to talk about because the interweaving of like subtle parts of the story, it's just to tell these stories correctly sometimes takes, it's like trying to talk about a complicated dream. There's sort of dream logic built into some of these synchronicities.
I think I'm going to jump in here for a minute because I was just thinking about something that you just did with your hands, the weaving motion that you just made with your hands. So my question for you was in relation to all of this connected directly to the numbers and the patterns and the synchronicities. You've talked a lot about that, right? That's a very big part of how you communicate your experiences is through, telling stories about these patterns and these ways in which things overlap in multiple ways, right? Like I think at one point you were talking to somebody, I wish I could remember the guy's name, but you were talking to somebody who was at that time reading an article about UFOs and owls that you had written. And then it was something like you happened to call him at the time that he was reading it. And then outside of his window, he saw an owl. So these sort of multiple interacting patterns of things. So my question for you is, considering that you like patterns, you follow patterns, you see meaning in them, there's a theory out there that geometric patterns in the universe, the fabric of the universe or sacred geometry, whatever you want to call it, the geometry of energy, that it's made up of synchronicities and these points at which we cross, these sort of magical things cross paths in front of us in our lives. Do you see any other patterns such as shapes or geometry in your life as well? What other patterns do you see? That's kind of what I'm curious about, because you've got the holy trifecta of the UFOs, the owls, and the synchronicities. I know that's your jam. But
yes,
then
yes.
There must be, I find that it never just stays like that, right? When we continue to have our experiences, they continue to unfold year after year. They keep expanding and more things come into the fray. So I'm curious to know if you see patterns anywhere else or in anything else.
Well, I would say that stuff is more of a soup than a pattern. Like I wouldn't be able to like plot it out like sacred geometry, but I would be able to say like it's a, it's everything's in the soup pot getting mixed all together at a certain point. That's what it feels like to me. I've certainly had, I had an event where, do you know what the Vesica piscis is? It's a two circles that connect. And it's kind of the, what some people would say was the basis of sacred geometry. But I had a vision of a thing in my eye. I could probably bring up some visuals. It might be complicated to do it right now. But I had a, this is hard to explain. This is the problem. You get into this and it's like, oh, the story gets so rich and multi-layered. In October of 2009, I laid out in the sun in a park in Pasadena, California. I was visiting a friend and just traveling, and I had been to Whitley Strieber's conference in Joshua Tree, but I went to Los Angeles to visit a few friends. And so I had some time, and I just laid out in a sunny day. It was wintertime for me, or October, so it was nice to be in the sun. Had been coming from Idaho, and you know how you can squint in your eyes and see and look at the sun through the twinkling of your eyes. I have a slight cataract in my right eye, and I saw a caricature of myself in my own eye. This sounds so crazy trying to say this. Here, I'm gonna do the cheapy thing. I'm gonna show you the image of it here.
Sounds very MC Escher or something.
Well, it was pretty simple. It's gonna take me a second to find it. I'm not going to find it in that book, so just forgive me. But it was the image itself was two intersecting circles, and there was a little face in one of the circles, and it was this little blank, sort of bald face with kind of big eyes. It looked a little bit like a gray alien. It looked a little bit like a death skull, and it looked a little bit like me. So it was like this kind of blending of these things. It's on my website. if you just Google, go to my website and type in face in my eye, the little face in my eye. So and those two intersecting circles, I had no idea, but several years later, someone contacted me. This person is an experiencer, full-on experiencer. He's an abductee. I'm going to say that straight up. And he contacted me. So this is this other pattern that shows up where people who have the contact experiences, those are the ones that say, oh, by the way, did you know, it might not have anything to do with UFOs, but it has everything to do with the weirdness of this phenomena. This guy contacts me and he says, that image you did of the thing in your eye is two intersecting circles. And these two circles touch at the diameter of both circles touch at the center of the circle next to it. And you get that Jesus fish shape in the middle. And that is by many accounts like the fundamental building block for much of sacred geometry. That's on the cover of Whitley Strieber's new book. It's called the Vesica Piscis, and his new book is about Jesus, and it has the Vesica Piscis right on the cover. So, like this odd little thing where I get this little detail in my eye. The reason what I did is I'm an illustrator, so I just sat and squinted into the sun very gently, and then drew it as best I could with a pencil illustration. And I feel very strongly I captured it very well in the pencil illustration, and then and there is a Vesica Piscis that shows up. So here's the sacred geometry that shows up in my eye. No one else can see it. It's only me, and no one can. You just have to sort of trust me that I actually saw it. But and this piece of sacred geometry shows up in this odd little alien face that only I can see. And there's a bunch more connected to that story. To tell that story correctly, we could have to add another hour to the show. So I don't know if that answered your question or not, but
that was a great story. And also,
Okay.
I just kind of like the double meaning of only that I could see is both you and your eye. Not
Yes.
That means
Yeah.
a lot, but it's just kind of fun. Nicole, I think, might have had a question. Not sure. Nicole? She may not be.
No, I didn't quite have a question just yet, but I did find the image, if we can do this.
Oh, there it is. Yes. Yes. So
Neat.
that's not the pencil sketch. That's a little one that I used Photoshop to it's a super eerie image, but that's the one I used
Right.
Photoshop, and you can see the two overlapping circles in that. If you scroll down a little bit, there's also the pencil image right in that same blog post. So like we're going super high tech here. We're holding the
I know,
phone up to the
right?
camera.
I
so.
could have loaded it to share screen, but here we go.
Yeah, that's a little more accurate to what I saw. But it was yeah. So there's that image, and so it was this eerie, strange image with these two overlapping circles.
Beautiful. It's almost has that rippling effect when you see water drops hit like concentric circles. And
Well, it was a you know how when you squint into the sun, like on a sunny day on the beach, and you just your eyelashes, you can get those little twinkly images that naturally want to float in your eye like that. And that's where that emerged. And I could see it. I could just squint into a bright light and it would just pop for a couple of months. I could see it, and then it faded away.
wow.
Let me ask you a question. Have you got a theory of everything in terms of, you've done a lot of work with synchronicities, and maybe there's one that you have with the when you're walking down and there's this things against the pole on the road.
Oh my word! I don't tell that one. I'm told that one. There's no UFOs in that, but it's a perfect example of synchronicity.
So have you got a theory for synchronicities? Because you know that George Hansen wrote the book called Trickster, and I have the theory of wow, that they're just doing this stuff to get your attention. What's your impression? Because you've done a lot on synchronicities, on the owl, on all this kind of stuff. What the heck is going on? Why is this stuff happening?
So some people would argue that there's a researcher named Kirby Surprise. That's his real name, Dr. Kirby Surprise. I think he's a psychiatrist, and but he's a doctor, and he has a theory that you, the observer, or me, I am generating them. I am putting out energy into the universe, and that energy is reflected back, and I am generating these magical events. That's actually a little hard for me to hold in my head. But he makes a pretty good argument that you can do tests. You can do random dice toss, and you can get heads more than tails if you make an intention. So in essence, you are projecting your own ideas out into the universe is reflecting those back. So my theory is that there's like a grand chess master, like with all the little pieces on the great big chessboard, and he's like capable of looking down into our reality. We can't see out into his reality, but he can look into ours, or he or they or whatever it is, the collective, the intelligence, the angels, the guardian spirits, whatever what you want to use, you know, your totem animal. They can look into our reality, but we can't look out into theirs. And they have, so it gets complicated, right? So they have to have the ability to look way off into the future and way off into the past and be just as comfortable with that. So some synchronicities take a decade to fully play out. So whoever the grand chess player is, they have to be very patient, or they're in some dimension of time that we don't have any comprehension of. So my sense is that there's some energy is messing with us for a purpose. That like these synchronicities are playing out for a purpose. Here, I'll tell you that story for the. So I'm saying it's a grand chess player, the same way you could put the chess pieces on the board and say, ooh, now that chess piece is going to go to that square and this one's going to go here, and then they're going to interact over there. It's someone doing it with that amount of, or some energy or some intelligence doing it with that incredible forethought. I may be totally wrong, but that's how I frame it for myself. So that story, so I do a lot of outdoor work, and I often get really red face, and some sunblocks would irritate my skin. Like I'd put sunblock on my face and my face would sting. That's kind of a normal reaction. And so I was asking people, like at the school I work for, was an outdoor school, like, you know, what do you use? What's a good sunblock? And everyone said, oh, Neutrogena 45. Neutrogena 45 is the best one. So I did that. Like a bunch of people were saying, everyone said the same thing, Neutrogena 45. So I was like, went to my hometown, and there's a little teeny health food store. And I went in and said, do you have Neutrogena 45? I'm like, no, we don't have it. There's a little teeny drugstore. And I went to the little drugstore and they said, do you have Neutrogena 45? They didn't have it. So I wanted to go to the big giant grocery store. It had just been built. It was a total, like a small town thing where no one really wanted this big giant grocery store, but they, you know, plowed over an old farm and put it in, and they tore down trees to put up the parking lot, and everyone hated it initially. So I wasn't going to pull into the big grocery store. So I drove home, and it was the weekend, or there was the day of the week that they had the annual roadside cleanup. It was springtime. So I could see the bags lined up along the road, and I help out when I can with that. So I pull into my house, and I didn't even go in the house. I just went into the garage and I got some plastic bags, and I figured I'm going to do a nice thing for the town. I'm going to walk from my house to the stop sign on this side of the highway and pick up trash. I'm going to cross the highway and walk back. So the house, from my house to the stop sign, is a half a mile, and I cross the road and do it. So I'll do a full mile, right? Half a mile there, half a mile back. I'll do it. Figure that was good. As soon as I start walking, it starts raining, and then starts sleeting, and it's that ugly, wet kind of April wet, sleety snow. And I was soaked and wet and cold. And I'm like, nope, I'm going to go all the way to the stop sign. And then I'm going to use that stop sign turn. I can see the stop sign, and I get to the stop sign, and I kid you not, like the stop sign's here, leaning against the stop sign, looking at me as I approached the stop sign, was a bottle of Neutrogena 45 on the side of the road. And I have to add the fact that part of that, I'm convinced part of that happened because I was doing a nice thing. Like I was doing a nice thing. I was picking up trash, right. And that's when the synchronicity happened. If it was any other time except for, and now this is when that happened, this was right at the dawn of when I was just barely starting to look into this stuff in my life. I looked at that little bottle and I said, I like nearly said it out loud, but the thought in my head was, it's them. And that really bothered me because I was like, who's them? Why did I think that? So
I love that's that's kind of a crossroads for maybe some people. You know, there's some people that would have looked at that and started doing numerology with the 45, or, you know, looking.
I was 44 years old. I was just about to turn 45. Yeah. So I was yeah, I did it too. Yeah. And it was at a signpost. I mean, well, that's like signpost. That's like, that's a word, you know, like it was leaning against a signpost. So that's like, it doesn't get any, it's not subtle.
It wasn't just sunblock. It definitely wasn't just sunblock. Yeah. I mean, sometimes I think we can go really far down the rabbit hole of whatever these things are, start doing numerology or looking up, you know, what the word Neutrogena is, or looking at the shape of the bottle. Does that mean something? But sometimes it's just what Grant says, you know, the wow factor. They're just saying, hi, we see you.
Yeah. I had a psychic tell me that there was a woman driving down the road she rolled her window down in the winter and threw the bottle of sunblock out the window and said, "Why did I do that?" So I don't know if that's true or not, but it's like, how did that get there? How did it get to the, like, leaning against the signpost? So
Do you follow your synchronicities? Do you use them as signposts in terms of?
So some people would say it's a sign on the path, on the path, right? So I'm a little more like another fellow who writes a lot about synchronicity. His name is Alan Green. Sometimes this goes by Alan Abadassa Green. He said it's more like being on the open ocean in a compass, right? So if you're on the open ocean in a cloudy day, you cannot get your bearings unless you have a compass. So he treats synchronicity like a compass, right? So I'm using synchronicity like a compass, and I made for reasons I could barely explain, I said, I'm going to follow this. I'm going to follow these synchronicities where they point. So yes, the signpost along the road, the compass, synchronicities have been my North Star. They have been my compass bearing for the last, since about 2009. So that's 11 years.
And your yellow line story too. I mean, that's a very visual representation of, I guess, what you could call signposts. You know, those 3 tags that you saw on a map in your vision, which then ended up actually occurring exactly that way in real life, which is hard to explain, I know, here without visual for our audience, but that story is just amazing. If you can tell that right now, that would be great. I know it's hard to do visual, yeah, but just having that having those 3 occurrences.
Okay, so I had slept out under the stars on March 10th, 2013. I slept out under the stars. I was coming back from a UFO conference, and while sleeping out under the stars, which is something I do, I sleep out all the time, outdoor stuff. I love it. I don't get a hotel. I was in southern Utah. It's a beautiful, idyllic, empty spot. I woke up in the middle of the night and I looked up at the hilltop, and this hill next to me had I looked up and I remember thinking, that looks just like a landed flying saucer. And I thought to myself, I'm I was pretty groovy, I'd been to UFO conferences and I had get psychic hits every once in a while, and I was a vegetarian and everything. So it was like, oh, if this was a flying saucer, I would know it. I would feel some intuitive knowing. So I stared at this thing just stared at it, and I was like, I got nothing. So it's like, that's somebody's house. Somebody built a big house up on that hilltop. I've since been back to that site. There's no house on that hilltop. And the stuff that unfolded from that night, to tell it properly takes, an hour. And to tell it, so I got home after 10 hours. So that happened coming back from a UFO conference, sleeping on the side of the road in southern Utah. I lived in Idaho. So I drove most of the length of Utah and then got into Idaho. And so I was at home the next day. And the first thing I did was look up on Google Maps to see if I could find that round house that was on top of that hill. There was nothing on the maps. I've been back to the site. There's nothing there. And I stood by my desk, and when I did a blog post for that, and I did a rendering of it. I did an illustration of the round structure on the hill, and I posted it on my blog, and unknowingly I posted it at 12:34, 1, 2, 3, 4. So, and I take that very seriously. That one was someone else pointed that out to me. Like, did you know that you did that at 1, 2, 3, 4? And I'm like, so I'm standing by my desk, and then I could just click. I have this perfect vision, vivid, hyper clear, 1 second of 3 dots on a map with a yellow line connecting them. And it was obviously southern Utah. And the westernmost line, the westernmost push pin, like a little push pin kind of thing that you would put on a map on Google Maps. The westernmost one was the thing that had happened the night before. And I knew it. And then I had to figure out what the other 2 were. And it took me a little while to figure it out. And I make maps. I do all kinds of outdoor work. So making a map is not a big deal. I just got right onto Google Maps, and the simplest map program, started making this map. And it's easy to do any 2 at the other end. So I have one at the other end where I had a profound experience of waking up inside a tent, experiencing total fear. And then I was floating out of the tent and I was in this white realm, and it plays out, and I had a big scratch on my chest the day after, and it plays out like UFO abduction. I never saw UFO. I got up the next morning, I'll tell you, and I walked around the tent looking for a burn mark in the grass where there would have been a flying saucer landed. There was nothing I could find. And then at the middle one, I had to find the middle one. And it was I had this event where I was sleeping, listening to an owl, and my friend Natasha was walking. She took a walk in the middle of the night. It was a beautiful, gorgeous, starry night. So she just walked around the desert that night while I was sleeping or listening to an owl. So here's this classic thing. I'm listening to an owl. There's an owl in a bush right next to my head. Natasha is walking on the Burr Trail Road, which is this rural dirt road in the southern part of Utah. And she sees what she thinks is a flashlight in the sagebrush. And then she's like, that doesn't make sense. It wouldn't be, who's out here? There's no one could be out here. And then it starts floating around. She realizes it's a floating orb, and it starts to come at her, and then it expands and goes poof. And she basically says it explodes. And it scared her, and she ran back to me and told me, and we packed up and left. It scared me too when she told me the story. So I was listening to an owl while Natasha was seeing a UFO. So it's right there, owls and UFOs, same moment. She was really close. She never heard the owl. Like, she wasn't that far away, and it was cold, clear winter, or excuse me, calm night in the desert. The sound carries forever. I can't understand why she never heard the owl. Now, when I did the research and those three things lined up on a map, everything about every doubt vanished at that point. Every single doubt vanished. Like I had spent 15 years where there was a constant kind of tape loop chugging around in my head. Like, this can't happen. This stuff, all this UFO stuff you feel like you've been experiencing, it can't happen. It's not real. It can't happen. It's not real. It can't happen. And I will tell you, that got unplugged and never got plugged back in again after I saw those three things on the map. So I call that my confirmation event. And it was, it happened the day after, actually, when you actually put it on the calendar, it was 2 days after the sleeping out under the stars in southern Utah. I will also add, I started the book, the first owl book, that day, the day I had the experience of that confirmation event, of not only seeing the vision in my mind's eye, but of connecting all the dots in the line and having that confirmation. When those three things lined up, like, that was not random. Somehow, some energy put me in those three spots, so I would purposely go back and solve the puzzle. So I make maps. I sleep out under the stars. So there's three different events of sleeping out. One was in a tent, but sleeping outside. Three different events, sleeping outside, 231 miles long, which is an anagram for 1, 2, 3. That doesn't count as much, but I did take note of that. And so the 3 points in the map, like, I'm the only one that could solve that. Like, I make maps. I love making maps, and I sleep outside. So, like, that was orchestrated for me and for me alone to play detective on myself. And
that was the moment when you confirmed that you were like an abductee. Because I remember
absolutely.
Before, I actually sent you an email and I said, come on, Mike, come on. Like, you're an abductee, because you kept saying, well, I'm not sure.
I wasn't sure. I was like, if it's someone else, what's the easiest thing in the world? It's the easiest thing in the world to be someone else and point and say, well, you're an abductee. That's obvious. When you try to say that about yourself, that's like, wow, you're talking. Yeah. I didn't want to say it. I was totally open to saying I might be.
Yeah, you kept saying I might be, and that's when I wrote you. I said, "Come on already." You keep
it all got cemented home on that night. So, or 2 days later after that event, and then I kid you not, I started writing the book that day.
Wow. So it does trigger you. You believe that they are leading you, or let me ask you the question you always ask everybody: are you on a mission?
Yes, 1000%. Yeah. So, I mean, that, so what's funny, because I ask, yes, I do have a sense of mission. Yeah. What's your sense of mission? And people will, like, I'll ask, 1 to 10. And most people who are within this thing, they'll kind of go 1 to 10. They'll go, can I say 11? And so I feel like that. Yeah. Like what's changed my life? Like I just get up in the morning. It's all I do is UFOs and owls. I research the stuff. I contact people. I talk to people. I write about it. It's like, it's taken over. It's like
Obsession.
obsession. And at the same time, it has been so rewarding. Like I have talked to so many wonderful people with these magical, powerful stories that like I answer emails and I just like, it's magic. People have these magical stories. Here, I'll tell you one that doesn't have anything to do with UFOs, but has everything to do with the power of this stuff. This guy contacts me. He's given me permission to tell the story. He lives in New England. His family has an orchard. So it's his wife and his kids. They run this organic apple orchard. And he was in his backyard and he meditates in the orchard. So he goes in and it's right against this hillside, and this hillside has a forest there. So he goes out there to meditate. So he meditates and there's this horrible screeching noise, this horrible noise in the forest. It's loud. And he like, it makes the, hair on the back of his neck stand up, and he's like totally freaked out. Every part of his body said, I got to get out of here. I got to run away. He said, no, I'm going to face this. So he hops the fence and he goes into the forest, walks up the hill to find out where this noise is. And there's this owl on a branch, and it's right low next to him. It comes right up to him. It's on this branch. And this owl like is staring at him and squawking and like, it's really angry. And he says, this owl is chewing me out. This owl is totally chewing me out. And then the owl flies off and he's like totally thunderstruck. And he goes back to his house and he tells his wife, oh my God, this thing happened in the woods, and this owl and on this branch, it was looking right at me. He's looking right at me. And he was squawking and yelling and chewing me out. And she says, oh, that's nice, honey. Can you set the table for dinner? And he tells his kids, the kids had no interest at all. And he's like, ugh, like, give me my camera. I'm going back out there. And he takes his camera. He goes into the woods. He goes to the same spot. And he says, okay, owl, my wife and kids don't believe me. I need a picture. And this owl flies in the branch. I have the picture. It's not quite as close. And it's a barred owl, which they are really loud owls. So so the barred owl lands in the branch and takes a picture. Now he's got this picture. And he goes back and shows his wife. And I said, after he told this whole story, I said, what were you meditating about? And he goes, I was meditating if there was a God. And I was like, so there's no UFOs in this story, but that is like everything it's like this. I mean, whether it's God or how, but just the like, that's not a little question. And then to get chewed out by an owl, like you asked that question, I'm like, how dare you ask that question? So
you always go to that thing about what were you thinking about? What's that all about? Where you ask people the event,
what were you thinking about?
The big event. So what's that all about?
Like people, like, what people say a lot of times before they see a UFO? It's like, what were you thinking right before you saw a UFO? And they said, I was thinking I want to see a UFO. That's really common. That happened to Richard Dolan. He was like I can't remember where he was. He was like walking his kid or something like that in a stroller.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
Still in a stroller. And he says, I wonder if I'll see a UFO. And he looks up and there's this thing in the sky. That's super common to have it. And I ask that because, oftentimes there'll be a point in the conversation, and I treat owls, UFOs, and synchronicities. So if you have a powerful synchronicity, or if you see an owl, or, you'll, that people will, I'm paraphrasing off the top of my head, and someone will say something like, I was really terrified of this stuff for a long time, and I feel like now I can finally face my fears. And at that point, boom, there'll be an owl. So here's a story. So one guy, he's actually become a pretty good friend of mine. His name is also Mike C. He's driving home from work. He was coming home. He works as a nurse. So he's crosses a bridge in a town in Massachusetts, like an urban town. So he's like in the middle of traffic, full daylight. It's like 3 p.m. He driving his car. He comes off the bridge and he's just about to make the turn onto the highway along the river. And this owl flies right in front of his windshield, comes right at him and scares the crap out of him. This big, huge owl, whoosh, right in his face. And then he gets his wits together and gets about a half a mile down the road. And he looks off to the side and there's a flying saucer hovering above like this industrial park next to the river, flying saucer. And he's trying to drive and he's caught in traffic and he's trying to keep his eyes on it. He's looking at this thing and it kind of raises up into the clouds. It was a cloudy day and it disappears in the clouds. And like, why didn't traffic stop? So, and then he says, oh, by the way, I was listening to you. He's talking about me. I was listening to your voice giving a lecture on owls and UFOs. and he had like downloaded the YouTube video audio and was listening to it on his MP3 player in his car stereo. And I was like, wait, what? You saw an owl and a UFO while listening to my voice talking about owls and UFOs? So before earlier, someone asked like, oh, like you kind of, someone was reading your book and then saw an owl and then saw UFO. That is so common to have somehow either my talk or people reading. I mean, I have one woman who contacted me. She's reading my book in bed. And then as soon as she opens it, there's an owl hoots outside. And her husband's there. She kind of shows him. She closes the book up and the owl stops. She opens the book up and the owl starts hooting again. She closes the book and the owl stops outside. I mean, this is like I'm almost scared to open my email in the morning because it's going to be one more story like this. And it's just, people say, could you write another book? And I could write 500 more books. It'd be the same story over and over and over again. It's so like, I'm at this point, I'm
You're owled out?
Oh no, I love the owl stuff, but I basically would be telling the same story if I published another book. It would just be just a word or two different. It's the same story with the same like weird power in those stories.
And what's it all about? So how do you fit it together? Like your role in it, and what is the OWLS all actually about? What's going on?
So when I was working on the first book, Richard Dolan was published the first book, and he would call me on the phone and he'd, Mike, I love this book. I'm loving your book. And like, I'm about halfway through. When do you get to the part where you explain what's going on? And I'm like, you're going to be disappointed, Rich, because I can't figure it out. And it's like, no, you're like, when do I get to the part where you explain, like, give me your like hypothesis and what it all means? I'm like, well, it's not in the book. So when I did the second book, I had to kind of give my best guess what it might mean. Yeah. So number one is the owl's an alarm clock. Like, it is just there to say, wake up. That's its role. Wake up. And, wake up to what is the question, and I would say waking up to some higher reality. And then the next thought would be that it's a marker or a totem for an initiation. And that's very common for people. Who sees owls is people who are on a shamanic apprenticeship. Like, if you're going to be the shaman in the village, you're going to see owls. That is well understood within the community of people, the indigenous communities that still treat shamanism as something seriously. But people outside that community, like, Westerners that take on shamanism as a life path or as a role or as a duty or whatever, they will see owls. So that's well understood. And then as an archetype. So the owl is an archetype, where an archetype is something that is imbued with a deeper meaning. So the owl is just a bird, right? But we can project into that this sense of wisdom, which comes from mythology, this sense of a messenger, which comes from a lot of indigenous cultures, that the owl would be a messenger between the veils. The owl can see into the night and can fly into the night. That very quickly turns into a metaphor for flying into other realms. And societies and cultures all over the globe have that as their core mythology around the owl.
What about the weirdness? I'm waiting for someone. Just jump in if you got a question, because you're just initiating numerous questions. Why the bizarreness? Because I talk about the theory of wow. Why do UFOs have lights on them so you can see them? Why do they make zigzags in a zigzag in the sky? Because they know everybody's going to go freak out. And they're going to. So you talk a lot about, and you actually go on stage with your owl, and you have the 4-foot owl, which makes no sense whatsoever. Yeah. And I don't know if you talked to Chris Peters, Barbara Streisand's stepson, where he has the 5-foot owl. Because I remember when he told me he had the one in the bathroom, and his wife saw it. And then she calls him in, and he comes in, and he says it's a 5 foot. I said, you sure it was 5 feet? You sure it wasn't 4 feet? No, it was 5 feet. And it was sort of like, so what's the deal with the weirdness of the owl? Because you actually go on stage and you show people, because people don't really realize it. They just say, oh, there's this owl, this 4-foot owl standing in the middle of the road. And it doesn't make any sense. People don't realize this is really, really weird. This, and you actually go on stage with a 4-foot owl and show people what it actually looks like. And
I have a 27-inch owl, which I kind of is this 27 inches that's a big bird, right? 27 inches is, and so that's about as big as any owl is going to get. So if someone said, I saw an owl that was about 27 inches, I'd say, okay, I give you that. I'll let you have that one. And so I put a little, it's pretty tiny. But so the 4-foot tall owl, the implication is that is a screen memory. So people are seeing something that is, I mean, I have the number of people I have that I was driving down the road at night and I came up to this, I could turn a corner, there's a 4-foot tall owl in the center of the road. And Dolores Cannon has this story. When she was, so Dolores Cannon has a story. She sees a 4-foot tall owl on the side of the road and she writes about it in her book, The Custodians. And she pulls up to it and it flies a little further down the road, and she pulls up to it and it flies further down the road. She's driving a big truck in Arkansas, and the owl can look over the hood of the truck. You the smallest car in the world and the biggest owl in the world, it ain't going to be able to look over the hood. So that's just plainly impossible. But that's what she saw. And like, I don't have to ask her because she said it. Like she's not around anymore, so I can't ask her. But in the book, she talks about it. So if I had asked her, what was going on in your life right before the sighting? In her telling of that, she said, that was the night I sat around with a bunch of coworkers at the clinic, a bunch of therapists. And she's basically said, I'm getting all this UFO stuff that's showing up in my research. Like, I got to decide whether I follow it. Like, do I ignore it and dismiss it and move on and do something else and just do the safe thing with my therapeutic work for people like stopping smoking and just family issues and stuff like that? Or do I follow this UFO thing? That she asked that question that night of herself. And that was the night she saw the owl. So you guess, why do I ask this question? Because you get this weird stuff like that. So why is it weird? I think that it's weird because now I'm probably wrong, but this is how I frame it in my mind. So the grand chess master that's putting all these things, they're in that timeless realm where they can see infinity in this direction and see backwards in time and forwards. And they can see, and anything that someone from that other realm does is going to seem weird to us. So I'm thinking that it's weird because it can't help but being weird because it's being generated from outside the boundaries of our physical reality. If that makes sense. Like you bring in something I'm in Michigan, you bring something from Ohio in, it's not going to be weird, right? If I'm in this 3D earth plane and something from a 6-dimensional cosmic realm enters my space, it's going to be weird. It's going to have a weird vibe to it. So oftentimes people will be in their yard and they'll just say, everything got deathly quiet. It got so weird. It's the strangest thing that's ever happened to me. And a UFO will fly over it. Like, just the reality itself feels weird when people are in the midst of this.
And then you'll remember it because you have a weird story I'll get to in a second. But the one I always bring up that I've sort of mentioned now was Betty and Barney Hill. Barney describes the beings have hats on. And so I always say, like, what do you got, a baseball team on Zeta Reticuli? Or I asked Chris Bledsoe, did you see the shadow people with the hat? Well, I saw that guy. Like, what's a shadow person need a hat for? And it's this weird sort of angle that people really don't sort of question. Or the other thing, and you had this example, where you wake up in the middle of the night, the alien is going, Mike, wake up, wake up, wake up. And then it wakes you up, gets your attention, and then boop, puts you out to sleep, like the way you described it. When you saw the beings, you can tell the story. What do? This bizarre thing that people describe. You pulled the covers over your head and went to sleep. And people describe this all the time. And that's the whole thing. It's like, why does the alien wake you up just to knock you out again? And it's like they want you to know. It's like the fear thing gets in there, and yet you immediately go to sleep. And it's this weird thing that this story will never leave your mind. It just sort of, and I think that was one of the stories that haunted you through your life. This story of these beings coming to you on that night.
Well, so what happened was I was lying in bed and I sat up and like a bright light was coming through the window. I worked with Bud Hopkins on this when he was still alive and talked about this. So I'm lying in bed. There's a bright light coming in the window, and I sit up and I look out the window. I wake up and sit up and look out the window, and there are 5 gray beings walking towards the house. I'm the only one in the house. It's on this lonely country road in Maine. I was living in Maine at the time, and they're walking in the snow, and there's this big bright light behind them. And it would be great if the bright light was the size of a flying saucer. It was about the size of a washing machine or a refrigerator. It was kind of a small light, and they were walking towards the house. Now that's like scary. That's a scary image. I felt nothing. I felt nothing at all. And I heard this voice in my head that says, now is the time to put your head on the pillow and shut down. And I went, oh, and I sat down. And so Bud Hopkins said, how often do you get woken up by a light? I'm like, I never. No, it's got to be a noise or something. It's like, and so, like, and that night had this, that moment had that weird silent quality to it. It had this weird clarity to it. It was like everything was hyper vivid. Everything was crystal clear. It was almost like it was dreamlike, but it wasn't a dream. There was and I've had that feeling several times in my life, and I'm very aware of what it is. I met a woman. She had a close-up UFO sighting while driving a car in Los Angeles in a convertible, and it's a pretty strange story. And it sure sounds like a contact event, an abduction event, but she was driving. Now, in city traffic, right in the middle of Los Angeles rush hour, she says, you know, when you take two magnets and you try to push them together, and they go click, and then turn one and turn it halfway and then try to push it again, and it won't connect. It's kind of, it's got this warbly sort of energy, kind of like there's nothing to see. There's nothing to see between the magnets, but you can't push them together. And there's this palpable, weird, warbling energy there. And she said that, you know what it's like being in the presence of the UFO? It's like being in between those two magnets. And when she said that, I was like, you know, that was the best description I've ever heard for like trying to describe that weird silence. I can't remember what your question was, but so I get on a roll sometimes. And
No, it was just this weird aspect that if you had this sort of scary event, the last thing you're going to do is pull the covers over your head and go to sleep, which I've heard this so many times, this weird thing where people just, like, if you're panicked, you're not going to go to sleep, but they just go to sleep and they instantly go to sleep as if this is or why does the alien actually wake you up? Like, well, if they're going to grab your sperm or do whatever they're going to do, they don't have to wake you up. It's like they're waking you up for a reason. It's like, and there's always this fear aspect, which is almost like a transition where they break you into the other realm. It's this forcing you to dissociate. And as soon as you've dissociated, then it's like, okay, go back to sleep. Now we've got you, and they take you off. Like, why do they, what's your interpretation of why they do this weird thing where they're sort of like coming to people, waking them up, and then doing whatever they're going to do, but knocking you out again?
So a lot of people don't get woken up. I'm convinced that a lot of people are having these experiences a lot, and then it's happening seamlessly. So one thought is like their little methodologies just mess up, right? They're, oops, like we didn't turn the knob quite right to make sure they stayed asleep, or their magic wand or whatever. So that, very common for like the spouse to try to wake up the other, the husband tries to wake up the wife, and the wife is totally asleep and won't wake up. But why am I awake? Maybe for the exact same reason that the UFOs have lights, so they get seen, so that people have this marker in their lives, that they know this. Joe Montaldo, who's a researcher out of New Orleans, he says that the owls show up as markers so that they know something weird has happened. So if you see a 4-foot tall owl on the road, you're going to always say like, that just doesn't seem right. And someday you're going to look into it. Like it's there on purpose, like a bookmark in a book.
Yeah. You probably have you talked to Candace Powers about the giant rabbit? Every time I talk to her, I say, Candace, tell the story about the giant rabbit. It's exactly the same story, except it was a giant rabbit on the road, and it would move a couple of feet, and then she'd move a couple of feet and drive. And then she told this whole story. It took like an hour to get home to a farmhouse about 1.5 miles.
Oh, that's Dolores Cannon's story. Exactly. Yeah.
And then she told her boyfriend, she said, Candace, I think you need to be regressed. And that's when she got Bud Hopkins to regress her. And of course, there was no rabbit in the middle of the road. It was, of course, she was being taken. And it's this screen image thing. You talked about birds. You talked about the owl, but you also know, can you talk a little bit about the hummingbirds? Because like I think it's Colin Andrews has hummingbirds. Chris Bledsoe has hummingbirds. Mm-hmm. So are they using these other sort of?
Well, so that's nothing new. That's like if you were to talk to a shaman, right? So get someone from the Indian reservation in South Dakota, they'd sit down with us and you say, like, oh, people are having these owl experiences and other people are having hummingbird experiences. He'd be like, that's like old hat. That's like part of our culture. Like the owl has a totem message. Hummingbirds are very light, delicate thing. So So that all I know is that Colin Andrews, I asked the reason, I basically said, oh, Colin Andrews got to have an owl story. So I asked him, and he said, no, I don't have any owl story, but I've got lots of hummingbird stories. He never actually told me any of the hummingbird stories, but so birds, that's very common. So here, this one woman, I'm going to have to change a couple of things here because I'm sure she'd be fine with me telling this. So her mother died, and there was a hawk that would hang around the house. She'd pull into the hawk, would be like me greeting the car. So hawk would be at the top of her garage. And she contacted me and she said, like, this hawk is showing up. Like, what do I do? And I'm like, well, how am I supposed to know what to do? Here's what you do. Okay, well, next time you see the hawk, ask it, what are you doing? I just said that, just like I had to say something. So I said, ask it why you're here. What? And then she comes home the next day. That the hawk is on top of the garage, and she walks up to the hawk and says, like, I respectfully ask, why are you here? What are you asking for? Why are you here? What message are you trying to give me? And now the hawk looks at her and flies off, and she walks in the house and the phone rings and there's no one there. And she's got one of those call things where she knows where the call came from. And it was this unlisted number from Francine, Massachusetts. She's a private detective, and she looks up some stuff, and there's no such place as Francine, Massachusetts. There's no town. There's and she did some more work, and there was like an old exchange back when it was dial rotor up numbers that was called Francine. It was just a place where the phone company had an exchange. Her mother's name was Francine. So
Wow.
this is every day I get a story like this of that power.
It's impressive.
How many stories do you have? How many owl stories would you have in your collection now?
So I have a file that has about 1,000 in them, and then that's the good ones. That's like the A+ stories. So I've got easily 1,000 A+ stories. That doesn't count the ones that I'm like people tell me, and the ones that I kind of keep in my head and stuff like that. So it's like it's a full-time job just to keep up with this, and it's a wonderful job, in the sense that I'm honored to be doing this because it's remarkable. People ask me, like, how's your life changed since taking on this owl stuff and this UFO stuff? And I remember the first time someone asked me that, I thought for a second, I said, I now live in a magical universe.
Yeah.
That brings me to a quick question. On your website, you have one of my favorite Nietzsche quotes about when you stare into the abyss also stares into you. And so my question to you, after your years of research and diving into this abyss of owls and synchronicities, what have you learned about yourself on that inward journey as you're exploring the outer depths of this high strangeness?
A lot of stuff fell away. Like a lot of stuff that I cared about before just fell away. Like I'm content driving an old car. Like I had to be like, a lot of stuff just like crumbled and vanished. I suffered terribly from clinical depression from the age 12 until I was 52. And part of this research, so I no longer suffer from depression. I have no symptoms, knock wood, but I feel like I'm symptom free. And I feel it's tied into this, like just being open enough to look into this. And like I was a tense person before I started looking into this stuff. Like I was like, and there was a point when actually going through like my life, I still can get kind of amped up at times, but I'm a much calmer person now. So that going through the inner journey so that first book was therapy. That was 5 years of writing and 5 years of internal therapy. Part of that was when I was working on the blog too, which some of those stories came from the blog. So that was therapy.
Wow. Thank you. That's wonderful. I hear that often. You hear people find a sense of gratitude or they notice that materialistic things become meaningless. And yeah, this sense of oneness, I think, is how a lot of people describe it. You feel at one with your fellow humans and everything. So
Well, it's still a struggle. Sometimes I don't feel one with my fellow humans, but I mean, I know it's there, like I know I can, if I like, I know it's in me to feel that, and I felt it before. So it's not easy. It's not like it's an easy journey, but it is definitely a rewarding journey.
Mm-hmm.
Jumping on this-
Oh, go ahead, Sinead.
Go ahead,
Oh,
Nicole.
I was going to say, the further I dive in to the phenomenon and personally look at myself, and Sinead, I think you've spoken on this before, just like waves of gratitude when you have those synchronicities that are affirmations. And yeah, and that's why I love this topic. It does kind of merge that spiritual self with the great beyond. So that's why I'm in it.
Well, I've often said that like a thoughtful, like two thoughtful people sitting down over a cup of coffee talking about UFOs, they should very quickly, yeah, there you go. They should very quickly get to, why am I here? What does it all mean? Is there a God? Like that should take them right to the biggest questions. And so that's my sense. It does. You talk about the weather, you don't go there,
Right.
but you talk about UFOs. If you're thoughtful, you're going to somehow, it'll take 5 minutes and you should be like struggling with like, what does it all mean? Why are we here? What's the
I'll just
purpose
jump
of
in
life?
here before Sinead asks the question. I always tell people that's kind of a joke. That I don't know if Sinead or Nicole have been to any conferences, but that you're describing exactly what happens at conference. Like your relatives and friends will think, oh, they're there and they're showing UFO photographs and they're stuff like that. And it's like, no, it's all within 5 minutes. It's like, is there a God? Like, why are we here? I mean, it's that conversation goes there every time. And it's so weird. It's never about UFOs when you're in a thing like that. It moves to these sort of bigger questions almost instantly. You're right.
You might have the first 5 minutes of a conversation or 2 minutes of a
Yeah,
conversation might be about UFOs, and then immediately is, yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Sinead,
I have been to conferences, and you're so right, Grant. I mean, that's how I knew it was my tribe, right? Like within 10, 15 minutes of walking in, I could just tell these people are my tribe. I'm not on my own floating around in this anymore, wondering what the heck is happening to me. Why has this always been happening to me? Why does nobody else, like, why can't I talk to anybody else about this? So it really is quite a happy making experience, as Nicole was alluding to, that once you get cracked open and these things start to happen, it's an amazing, wonderful, magical experience that does create all of these emotions. So I want to go back to kind of jumping off what Nicole was saying. I think we were kind of reading each other's minds a little bit there, because she asked very close to what I wanted to ask you. Going back to your stories, all the stories that you have, not of your own necessarily, but all the stories you have from so many of the people that you've met and collected stories from over the years, that you could write 500 books about it. There are that many. And touching on what Nicole was bringing up about how these experiences affect our lives, how they change us, not just internally, but also how they actually change externally our lives as well. Many things about our lives just become different naturally, automatically, as a result of this change we feel inside. Have you kept up with the people that you've collected these stories from? Like, do you follow up with them? And so that's part A of my question. Do you follow up with them? Part B is, and then, what's that like? Part A, what is that like when you follow up with them? Do they tell you more, or are their experiences often the one and only experience they have? And then part B of my question is, how does it affect their lives? Like, how many of these people do you find are really struck by this crazy experience they have, but then it becomes that crazy thing that happened to me 15 years ago, and they just never stop thinking or talking about it? And how many of them have this crazy experience, and then more and more keeps happening, and it keeps unfolding? Like they dive in, they open the door and walk through it, and it becomes a part of their life, as opposed to people who maybe just have the one experience, or have one experience and then are not sure that they want more, and maybe keep the door closed because they're not sure if they want more of that. Do you encounter both? What do you find?
So I'm counting all of that. Yeah. So to some degree, like some people have a very traumatic experience and they frame it as trauma, which they can be. They're dark, scary stuff happens. And so I don't want to be the person that says, oh no, you're misinterpreting it. It's all love and light, because that's their experience. It's not up to me to tell someone else what they've experienced. I've had people do that to me and I didn't like it, like sort of like I'll tell my story and they'll say, well, here's what really happened. And I'm like, so like, I can't do that. So as far as oftentimes what happens is people will, a lot of people reaching out to me are in a place of like, they're shook up, they're struggling with their experiences. And they'll, a couple of experiences in the book that I've got back to people and years later. Oftentimes, what happens, I'll be in the town where they live and I'll be like, oh, that guy lives in, let me just, so I'm like, I'll be in New York City, wherever it might be. I'll be in New York City for, a few days at the end of the month. We should get together. And so we get together and have coffee. And if it's been a few years, what I hear very consistently, like they were totally confused and shook up initially and like doubted everything. And they'll say, well, this other stuff happened. And I recognize that it's a real thing. And it's been confirmed for me that it's a real thing. And then another thing. So one thing that also happens is that people have like a surface set of stories that like makes sense. Like, here's the story. Like I saw a UFO and it was this weird thing. I was driving and I saw the UFO. It was very clear. And then, and then you'll talk with them a year later and they'll say, well, this other stuff happened. And then they will tell you the weirdest stuff, the weirdest, strangest stuff that they were ashamed or intimidated or embarrassed to say the first time, because the weird stuff doesn't make any sense. Seeing a flying saucer out of there, while driving is one thing. And, and then seeing an owl when they got home, that's one person's story. And then, but the really weird stuff is woven into this. And oftentimes you won't hear that the first time you talk to someone. You'll have to, talk with them hour and hour. You really have to dedicate some time because they're not going to share it unless you're ready to dedicate that time. And then, so the other part of the question was, so my answer was like, oh, I'm getting all of the things.
Lives? Like, how does it change their lives, their perspectives? What is it? What do you hear from these people as to, like, after the initial shock subsides and they start integrating the experience? How does it change who they are? How does it change maybe other people around them or circumstances of their lives or even their life trajectory? I mean, I've heard stories about people who have completely changed their path. Something will happen to them, even just one occasion, one event that impacts them, and they might be on a career path and that completely changes, or they're going to make a move and then they decide to move somewhere else. So what do you see in terms of the impact internally and externally on these people?
Well, to try to sum it up in generalization would be tough because it's all over the map. So all of those things you just said, I'm hearing, you're confirming everything that shows up in the people I talk with and the people within this research and the people who come to me with their owl stories, that they have a powerful transformative event. So, the level of being transformed is subtle. What's very common is people volunteer at the animal shelter. That's really common. Like, oh, like I started volunteering. So that's like that's a nice, altruistic, benevolent, wonderful thing to do, to volunteer at the animal shelter. And then other people were like, oh, I quit my job and I became a psychic. I've heard that one a lot. Like all of a sudden I was flooded with this psychic stuff and now I'm a working psychic and I'm helping people. And I, oftentimes people would say, like I do some of the work for pay and some of the work I do for free so I can help people. They'll have a transformative event. Lots of divorces where a spouse will change and the wife will change and the husband will stay the same. The wife will have a powerful transformative experience, whether it's through, I kind of lump all this stuff together, a mystical experience of a UFO contact or a mystical experience of an owl contact or a powerful mystical synchronicity. It's enough to change someone's life. And they'll, their partner won't change. They'll stay the same. And so they'll grow apart. Yeah, that's very common too.
I'll interject a little bit, and I have a question. Do you have any stories of multiple owls as opposed to just the one? Is there, like myself, I get visited by owls And occasionally I hear one, but it's usually, I call it, it's the families here.
Mhm.
And like at certain periods of time of day, like, and it will be synchronistic. Like I get 555. I'm like, oh, it's 5:55. Woo time's on. Well, more often than not, there's owls, and it'll start off as one, and then it's like 4 more will answer them. Or I'm a night owl. I often stay up till 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning, and from what I think I know about owls, that's a unusual time for them. Maybe dawn as the sun is coming up, or when the sun sets, that might be where they talk a lot. But in the dead of the night, like right before I fall asleep, it's like kind of like Grant says, it's like, why do you wake me up to put me to sleep?
Mhm.
It's like I'll be dozing off, and then I hear all the owls, and I always think, now I can sleep. And then I'm out. So
So you're asking, so people see, yeah, it's
Right.
not uncommon for people to see lots of owls. Like I
Yeah.
was, I mean, I saw, one summer, autumn of 2009, I was seeing owls all the time, like
Mhm.
multiple owls. I was hiking with a friend. We saw, we were doing an altruistic thing. We were camping, and we were camped by this pond. The pond was really murky and green, and I had been in the same spot before, and like everyone's like, oh, this water's gross, we have to drink this water. And I'm like, give me all your water bottles. Me and Peter this guy Peter, we'll all go hike and fill up the water bottles. I've been here before. Just about a half mile up the trail is a spring. We'll fill all the water bottles out of the spring, and then we'll come back with our full water bottles. And we did, and we handed the water bottles out. And then when we got back, so on that walk there and on the walk back, we were having the most mystical, spiritual conversation about UFOs and about synchronicity. This guy he's a psychiatrist, and he's really open to this stuff. And so he was great to talk to. And I was like, that was a chapter in my life when I was pretty shaky. And so he was wonderful to talk with. And we get back to camp, and that altruistic thing, like cleaning up the trash on the side of the road. We're doing a nice thing. We lay down, which something I've never done before. It's a beautiful, sun is setting. We laid right down in this field, light on our backs, and looked at the sky. Both of us, we didn't decide to do it. We both just laid down. As soon as we laid down, these 5 owls came out of the trees and swooped right above us as we're laying on our backs. We laid down first. The owls came out after we laid down. And he's a psychiatrist, and the owls flew away, and we were both like, oh my God, that was the coolest thing. 5 owls, big owls flying right above our faces. And he said, what were you talking about? Or I asked him, what were we talking about right beforehand? And I said, you were talking about your mother. He said that to me. You were talking about your mom. And I was like, I was? He's like, yep, you were talking about your mom right before the owls showed up. Now, my mom had been suffering terribly from Alzheimer's at that point. And I woke up I had a dream that night. And it was nothing in the dream except my mom's face. And she was crying, and she seemed sad. And the next morning I was like, we had cell phones, but you can't get service in these mountains. You have to be on a peak. So with the team, we got to this crest, and I pulled out the phone and I called my mom, and she was fine. And it's hard to, she was in the throes of Alzheimer's. So we asked her anything, she would say, oh, I'm fine. But there's no UFOs in that story, but it has that's an emotional story for me to tell. And that those owls played a role in that complex emotional story, with Peter and I having a conversation of sort of a spiritual conversation about UFOs, and it culminating with me, like with needing to call my mom.
Didn't you have an owl experience where you got them twice? You were with a girl or something, and
Oh yeah, that was that
and
one.
then you came back, and they were again the second time.
So I camped with this woman. Her name is Kristen, and this is another thing. This that I keep an eye out for is people with the name Christ in their name. Christopher Bledsoe Jr. There's like the number of people who contact me named Chris it's settled down a little bit lately, but man, there was a point when it felt like I couldn't, like every email that came in, it felt like they were named Chris, or Kristen or Christina or Chris or Christian. So there's that Christ name showing up. So her name is Kristen, and I met her, like total stranger. This is usually, I start my talks with this story, And this is one more of these stories, which is layer upon layer upon layer. And I just talked to her recently. We texted. I hadn't talked to her in years, and we just texted. And I asked her something. I'll get to it at the end. I basically said, let's go camping. Total stranger. Let's go camping. So we went camping for one night, and these owls showed up, and they showed up right at sunset. And it was right as I was cooking dinner. And it was right as she was saying something that I thought was so profound, like this total stranger. And I'm like, wow, this is a really profound story. Like I didn't expect her to have this. Like I was impressed. There was this depth and this power to what she was sharing. And then these owls showed up. And then 4 days later, we went camping again. Same thing. The owls. So that was 3 owls showed up the first time. The second time, 3 owls showed up again. And I was like the first time they showed up, we were camping in a totally different spot for just one night again. And these 3 owls showed up. The first time that it happened, they were kind of be off in a tree off in the distance, or they'd kind of swoop kind of high above our heads. This next time, they were landing on the branch right next to us. And this one owl like landed at our feet. And both Kristen and I were just like gobsmacked. Like, how is this possible? I had been reading a lot of UFO literature at that time, and I knew that the owls were a screen memory. So I, in the moment, was like looking at this owl, trying to figure out, is this a real owl? It looks like a real owl. I'm pretty sure it's a real owl. I think that's a real owl. And I, in essence, heard a voice in my head that very clearly said, I was looking at a real owl, and a voice in my head said, this has something to do with the UFOs. You are an abductee. So that's this message, like the title of the book is The Messengers. The message could not have been more clear. 2 nights in a row. So this woman, Kristen, and I both started looking up totem animals and what's the meaning of owls and such. I asked her later, months later, what were we talking about that first night when we saw the first owls? I remember you talking about something interesting, and I took note of it. What were we talking about? She said, oh, I remember exactly what I was talking about. I was talking about my deepest, most heartfelt feelings of what God means to me. So there's one more example of that. I talked to her just about a week ago, just over Facebook chat, and I kind of said, listen, I got to ask, did it feel orchestrated, those owls? Did it like feel orchestrated? And she was like, what do you mean by orchestrated? Like, I'm like, well, orchestrated. And she said, well, I mean, shortly after the owls were there, like I left town and I found the single most important book of my life, and I think it saved my life. I'm like, okay, yeah, that's what I mean by like, that's exactly what I was. So, what was happening in your life leading up to the event? What happened after? She basically said, well, just shortly after that, like I found the book that I feel saved my life. So.
This changed your artwork at all? I mean, obviously you're going to draw different things, because of your experiences, but I mean, the actual experience of creating your art, or maybe the creative process, has it changed for you at all since you started having all of these synchronicities, everything you've been talking about and writing about?
I don't think it's changed it at all. I mean, my illustration style and my drawing style is constantly morphing and stuff like that. So, I mean, it's all, I can kind of look at a drawing I did 15 years ago and like just by, the scratchy lines and stuff, that's 15 years ago. And then, that's 20 years ago. And, I can, that's last week. I can totally just tell by the way the pen moves on the page. But no, I don't think it's impacted that at all. What it has given me, it's given me permission in a way to sort of say, like, I'm an artist. Like I always was kind of, like I would always call myself an illustrator, because I worked doing illustrations for ad agencies and books and magazine articles and stuff like that. It's different than being an artist. And I will say that like the mystical quality of these things have allowed me to just say, like, I'm an artist. I can say it now, which I wouldn't have been able to say that comfortably 10 years ago. I kind of knew it, but I wouldn't say it aloud. It just felt presumptuous.
You ever thought about doing a children's book?
Yep. I started a couple years ago, and I've got my plate's full. So, and I haven't done anything. So, but I have thought about it.
I think children would obviously be very receptive to stories about owls that are illustrated so beautifully like that. Yeah.
So do we have time for another story here?
Sure. Yeah.
So this guy, Ben is the fellow who said, that was a Vesica piscis in your eye, that thing in your eye, the two circles. That was the guy who told me that story. So he says, oh, I've got some stories. And so he had a story. He's telling he's driving his kids. They're little. He's driving them home from a roller skating birthday party. They're all in the car. So he's got all the kids, they're in the van, and he's driving home, and they're like, tell us a story, tell us a story. So he's got all the kids in the car, and he's like, I'll tell a story. He tells them his UFO stories. And he framed them a little bit like campfire stories. He had never told anyone, like never told his family. So here's this car full of like 11-year-olds. He's telling these stories. And I'm like, wow, what a cool story. And he has a missing time story. And it's kind of a spooky campfire story, the way he tells it. And at the very end of the missing time story, he's driving along and an owl flies right in front of the car, just as he finishes telling the final story. So later, this is not his kids. He's got a couple kids and they're like, Dad, like read us a bedtime story. Totally different thing. Earlier that day, sorry, this is the problem with telling these, to tell these properly. There's so many layers to it. Earlier in the day, they went hiking, him and his kids, and they would hike down the trail, and this owl would be on a branch, and they would walk past the owl, and then the owl would fly along the trail and pass them and land on a branch. And then they would walk down the trail, and they would pass the same owl, and the owl would fly, and they'd see it fly from branch to branch. So the owl followed them on this hike, and the kids thought it was the greatest, coolest thing ever. And the dad, Ben, was kind of like, he was kind of unsettled. It was scary for him. So they get home, and it's that same night, and everyone says, all the kids say, read us a story, and it's great, pick a book. And so there's this book called Say Boo. It's about a ghost named Ben. The ghost is named Ben. So it's this ghost, and it's funny because I got to footnote this in the book, because I could footnote a little kid's book. And so the ghost is getting ready for Halloween, and he has to scare people by saying boo, but he keeps on forgetting. So he goes up to the cow, and he wants to scare the cow, and he says moo, and then so he can't scare the cow, and so it's setting it up so he can say who to the owl, right? But so the line in the book that he's reading, Ben reads the line, and then Ben looked up and saw a big owl in a pine tree. And right at that moment, the dog starts barking downstairs, going crazy. He had just read that line. And so he runs downstairs and opens the door. The dog's barking at the door, and like, what's going on? So he looks outside, there's nothing. And he looks up at the big pine tree in his yard, and there's an owl staring down at him. The last words he spoke were, and then Ben looked up in the big pine tree and saw an owl. When to do this, like to write these stories, I go back and forth and I send everything to the person, the witness, the person. It's not my story, it's their story. I'm like, I'm not signing off until you are absolutely going to give me the okay that this is how it happened. So Ben was great. Ben was super easy to work with. And he was like, oh, this happened a little bit more like this. And let's change this line here. And that kind of feedback on me. So as we're doing this, he says, this is the same story. These two stories, the same story. I was in the car trying to find my voice, telling my kids this part of my reality. I was telling my family about myself. I had my own voice to tell my family. And then the ghost, Ben the ghost, was trying to find his voice. He couldn't say boo, he would say who or moo. And in the book ends where he finds his voice, is that this is the same story. So this is what floats my boat, these stories that have such a, like on the surface, they're one story. You dig a half a layer deeper, there's another story. You go way down deep, and there's this mystical story there.
Mhm. I've sometimes heard to this as this entire process of, denying the experience, diving into it, having your awakening. I've recently heard it referred to as closing your loop. And I think it's Alan Stiebelman, I think is how you say his last name, is where I first heard the term coined. And he noted in his work, and he also collaborated with Jacques Vallée for one of his films. And they noted that after you close your loop, some experiencers are given a name or receive a name. Have you come across any information like that? Or have you received a name? Like, for instance, after my second big sighting, which kind of affirmed so much for me. And Grant, I don't know if you remember, this was kind of a little synchronicity. You and I happened to be talking about the Avery, and I kept teasing like, oh, what would my bird name be? Well, I went through a sighting and I got a message of oneness, and I was told to read a poem out loud for everyone and a second poem for just myself. And the second poem, the first line is, "You are called Snowbird," or "Your name is now Snowbird." And I just wondered if you had come across any data like that or any mystical happenings with being given a new name.
I've got certainly in more of a shamanic context, I have, where people will, there's a woman, Denise Lynn, who saw a close-up UFO and years later started doing spiritual work, or actually was doing spiritual work at the time. And she's now, she writes a lot of books. She's writes books on spirituality and totem animals. And she's a wonderful, like big-hearted, radiant person. And she has a story of going into the woods to find her spirit name. And we like meditated, closed her eyes and meditated. And basically the intention was to find her spirit name. And then the forest got totally quiet. All the same thing, that weird silence. That's a UFO. That's a UFO thing, you know, that weird silence. But this was no. And then she opened her eyes and she was sitting on the forest floor, and on the branch right in front of her was a big great horned owl staring at her. So I can't remember the name she felt she was given, but I think it was White Feather was what she said, because the owl left some white feathers. And I've also heard there's a story in the book of a woman who took mushrooms. Her name is Shauna Home, and it's shamanic ceremony. This is again in shamanic context. She had always been with a mentor when she had taken the mushrooms, and she took mushrooms, and she's also seen a UFO. It's like this thing where it's like is she an abductee? Is she had contact? It's like very murky to say, but these stories that emerge play out with the profound power of the kind of stories that people with these contact experiences will have. So she took a bunch of mushrooms, and all of a sudden she's in her bedroom, and the whole interior of the bedroom is like covered in these white feathers, and it's this trippy thing. And this huge like owl comes up to her and says, "You are no longer daughter who yearns. You are now daughter who knows." And she felt she was being taken from the 3 stages of womanhood, from the maiden, the mother, and the crone. And she felt she was making the transition from mother to crone in that point, you know, or wise woman. And so she was basically felt she was being renamed daughter who knows. And that was very formal. There's no flying saucers, there's no UFOs in the story, but it feels like the kind of thing that plays out in this context. I get that people like Amazon kind of thing was, you know, like people will review the book like, this book is crazy. This guy, he's like taking people seriously who take mushrooms, and like that data should be thrown out and not used at all. I'm like, well, that's the best stuff that's like the most powerful mystic. It's the people being on board a UFO is like this mystical experience for people. When people talk about it, they talk about it in this strange, trippy way of being on board the craft. And people talk about their powerful mushroom or ayahuasca experiences, and they struggle to define what's undefinable. They struggle to talk about the realm that's not our realm. Like they're traveling to this mystical realm and then returning, which is the mythology of the owl. So and you know, so that woman was from, you know, went from daughter who yearns to daughter who knows. And that's something I've been like, I feel like people are seekers, like people who have these experiences. They're like, that's a really good single one word thing. People who, not everyone, but people who are like immersed in this are seekers. They're the people who are seeking for these answers. And both those examples would be perfect examples. Almost every story I've told tonight, the people are seekers. So.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Oh, happily.
Okay, we got about 15 minutes left, so let me, I got a couple more, but I'll just do my one here. You probably know the two-part question. What do you use for data? Today I have I mentioned in the pre-show that I have this woman who has these, she's in her 60s, thinks with grays, but it's of course in her 60s, she's not going to be anything baby related or whatever. Suddenly starts having encounters again, finds these two triangles, one on one wrist, one on the other wrist. And then she has this experience last Saturday evening where she has this thing put in her ear. She has this thing appears in her ear. Is very questioning. And so we were sort of chatting about it on Facebook today. And of course, people start to attack, you know. It's like, no, well, I would say, you know, because I brought up the story of the song called Lights, where this female singer talks about lights and they're calling me home. She's afraid of the dark. And what I found is that when you go to get the data, it used to be on the free site where they used to have all this data and they pulled all the data, all the commonalities that you link. Is there a place that you go in terms of linking? Like, for example, how many experiencers find triangles on their body? How many experiencers are afraid of the dark? Because there's one guy who's saying, no, I think that's pretty common. And I'm thinking, no, I think I've heard lots of stories of experiencers as kids who they want the closet door closed.
Mm-hmm.
They're afraid of the dark and stuff. But there doesn't seem to be any data available in order for these people to back up the fact that they're not crazy. Because people say, no, you're just making this up or whatever. And there are these patterns that I think you've collected, but Free used to have it on their site, and then they pulled all that data. They went through the 3,000 experiencers and how many had near-death experiences, how many had downloads, all this kind of stuff.
And
what
that's
do you do for data? Just your own data?
You know, I have read some of that stuff. I have Ray Hernandez's book, that 800-page book. It's
Yeah.
It's a big book, and it's like it just chart after chart after chart. So like I'm fascinated by that stuff, but I'm totally going anecdotal. Like I haven't made a spreadsheet or anything, and I've, so what I did for a while, which I thought was really interesting, is I collected the questionnaires that were being put out. So MUFON had a questionnaire, Brad Steiger had a questionnaire, Bud had a questionnaire,
Near-death experience.
Jacobs. Yeah. So like these are questionnaires for experiencers. And what I was looking for, the commonalities in the questions, and there were some weird ones. Are you afraid of closet doors? That's you're afraid of closets. That's a funny one. And that's common. So I have no fear of closet doors, but some of them were like, one of them was consistent throughout all of them was, what's your sense of mission? That question was phrased in all of them. So I was curious what the researchers were seeing as patterns. I said something at the beginning and I want to get back to it as far as a pattern that I'm seeing. I'm drawing a blank on it right now.
It would be interesting if you were to do an article on it, because you got quite a bit of data. I don't have the data. I never really paid any attention to it. But for experiencers, when they see this kind of stuff, because they'll come to you and they'll say, like, I'm afraid of the dark, or I have these triangles, and then you go, well, it happens all the time. It does, and it sort of gives them some validation when they realize that this is common, that they think that they're like Mr. Weird Street, especially the triangles. That's the same sort of thing as why does the alien wake you up? It's like, why does he put a triangle on your body? And it's this, to me, it's like this weird thing is like, no, that wasn't a dream. No, that was for real. Or why did they put your clothes inside out and backwards, which I've had lots of times. Where, in fact, one guy just died here, an experiencer where I live. And I said, you had that experience, didn't you? He said, yeah, I took a photo of it. And he takes this photo of himself with the shirt inside out and backwards, which it's just this idea. But most people, when that happens to them, they think they're going nuts. They don't realize this is a common pattern. But there's no data, as far as I know, that's out there where all these things are actually tracked, where an experiencer can go and say, oh, this is common.
It's anecdotal. I mean, there might be some leading stuff, but I mean, it's researchers by researcher. It's anecdotal. There was one woman, her name Michelle Levinge. She wrote a book called the Alien Abductee Survival Guide. It's a great book. And I think it's hard to find now, but she has this great story about going to bed with like her t-shirt that she loved, a Queen. She got it at the concert, Queen t-shirt, and she woke up in the morning with a Tweety Bird t-shirt on, a yellow Tweety Bird t-shirt. And she's like, where's my cool t-shirt? Like somehow, so someone else woke up at some other place with the Queen t-shirt and she's never found it since. So what I was going to say is, like, here's a weird little thing. Like I have there's nothing to see. I mean, you have to, like, I have a triangle, 3 dots on my left wrist, right about here. My right wrist, excuse me. And no, it's on my left wrist. It's my left wrist, right about here. Sorry. And I had it as a little kid. And I remember walking to school and being a little kid and being able to see these 3 perfect dots, perfect equilateral triangle, tiny, maybe all of like, half an inch, a little smaller than half an inch, perfect. And but what I can do now is I can shave the hair on my arm and see it, but it gets kind of lost in the hair on my arm right now, right there. So as a little kid, I didn't have hairy arms like that, but I could see it totally clearly. It's faded a lot. I mean, I was 10, now I'm almost 60, so that's 50 years ago. And so, but it's still there. I took a picture of it. I wrote a little article on it and put it on my blog. Without a doubt, like by a factor of 10, that gets more hits than anything on my blog. And the title of the blog post is 3-dot triangle scar left wrist. And what it tells me is people are Googling triangle. I have this weird triangle thing on my wrist. I'll go type it into Google, and then my blog post comes up. So that, without a doubt, of all the things I have on my blog, it's like 900 posts on my blog, that is far and away the most popular one. So that tells me that is very common. And then I'll also say that that's like my job now, is to get back to people and say, oh, the stuff you said, that's actually pretty common. What you said, like that, I hear that story often enough. And sometimes I have to take a step back where they won't tell exactly the same story, but they'll tell a story with a similar flavor or tone. Like it's obviously not exactly the story that I've heard before, but I've heard similar stories with that same power. And often that power implies afterward the person like having this kind of mystical shock that the synchronicity or like, it's not just the UFO sighting, it's going well beyond UFO sightings, that the UFO sighting with the associated synchronicities and OWLS really shatters them. And then they reach out to me and say, oh, just what you've said, I've heard that many times.
Yeah, I think that's important because they come to you and I like almost like we're doctors. It's like you see something on you got a pain in your whatever. And then you go to the doctor and he says, oh, that's just this. And as soon as he tells you, oh yeah, it's very common, don't worry about it. And then you go, oh, okay. And it's all gone. But until then you think you got cancer, you're going to die. And I think that's where I find I don't have that much that I can really give to experiencers in terms of the things that they're describing. But I know in the back of my mind, I'm going, no, this is common. This is, and that's what I say to them. And it basically makes them feel better. And then they open up more about what they've experienced.
Exactly. Yeah. And then and you can hear them. Like sometimes you'll be in the chat box with things, or the email come back like, oh my God, thank you for saying that. I had no idea. I'm so relieved that I'm not alone. And I'm like, you are not alone. Like this is very common. Yeah.
Any other questions, Nicole or Sinead?
I don't. I'll just agree with you on what you just said. More often than not in experiencer groups online, it is just that simple act of, people sharing their stories and finding commonalities that, that bring people peace. And I tracked down about 700 orb stories. That's when I realized I wasn't special and it was comforting. So
yeah,
thank you guys both for doing what you do, and helping other experiencers just by sharing this. And the chats we have on these shows, I hear feedback like that as well. It's like, oh, I always thought that, or I heard you guys discuss this, and I always get replies afterwards. So it'll be nice to see what people say about this chat. So, and
that's been a like at the end of the day, I feel good about what I'm doing. Right. It's a little bit like, no, my brother thinks I'm crazy. Like, what are you doing? Like, how do but it's, like, oh my, I'm like, people thank me. like really thank me in a heartfelt way. Like that's any job that you have where people do that is, so like I wrote these books. They are not written for the general public. They're written for people who are have one foot in this, immersed in this mystery.
I have to jump in here with a question. Have you ever heard from owl people, like from university owl people, or somebody who's like
Studies
tapped into
owls?
it and say, what's this all about?
Like an ornithologist that's actually studying owls?
yeah.
Like, almost never, actually. A little bit. What I do hear from is people studying shamanism. So like at the other end of the spirit animal thing. And I actually I can't remember the name. It's a Catholic college in New Jersey. I'm drawing a complete blank of the name. A really respected Catholic college in New Jersey, and they with a straight, it's not a it's a secular curriculum, but this book, The Messengers, the Blue Book, was given as an assignment for a modern folklore class.
Wow.
And I was like, I thought for a second, like, that is the perfect book for that. Like it's written present day, and it's about basically, and they read the whole class read the book and then discussed it as modern folklore. And I was like, that is actually, I applaud that. That's a great way to frame this. And folklore has its own power, right? So you have a bit of folklore. It resonates within people. Like, I don't really care if people believe this. I do care that they recognize that there's mythologies in place, and that people are having. So my thought is that there's an ancient meaning in a folkloric sense or a mythological sense to the owl, and that these stories are still happening present day in this. So that we don't have ancient mythologies. We don't talk about that around the dinner table like we might have, around the campfire, but we still, the experiences are still happening. So instead of going to the shaman at the edge of the village, they're coming to me to tell their stories. So,
Sinead, have you got anything you want to ask before we close here?
No, pretty much what Nicole said. I don't have any more questions at the moment, but just what all of you said, really, that experience of validation and of meeting community is so incredibly important, I think, for all the people that are having unusual experiences. And they're, what's still fascinating to me is that I had no idea how many people have experiences like this until I started meeting other people who had experiences. I really did not think that this many people all over the world had these experiences, and that so many of us, kept it on the down low for so long because of all of those reasons that we all know of, the stigma and the being told you might be crazy or you're oversensitive or you're imagining things or whatever it is. So that experience of validation really is so incredibly powerful and so incredibly important. And the community is such a big part of that. And I think that this is a different kind of, like Nicole was talking about gratitude earlier, I think the gratitude that people feel when they have their experiences validated is not the same kind of gratitude we might feel in other areas of our life, because these experiences are telling us who we really are. And I feel like that's the real inherent power of these conversations, of the validation, of the community, of the stories, of all of it. It's waking us up to who we really are. And we really need that. All of us need that. And we know when we have that experience, we recognize it, and we recognize how much we need it. So I think it's wonderful that you're doing this work, Mike, and that you have these books out and all these people feel like they can come to you. I think that's really, 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 important on so many different levels. Yeah. So thank you for all the work that you're doing and for being here tonight to share it with us too.
you're very welcome. The topic that originally started this was the artist topic. And so I was drawing cartoons. That was my job. Like, I drew cartoons for magazine articles and stuff like that. Like, I was a cartoonist. So I was like on the social strata, like cartoonism, it's pretty down there, pretty low. Like, you have a permission to be kind of goofy and playful. And so when I wasn't the president of the bank when I came forward with my experiences. And I was that, being an artist or an illustrator, allowed me to share this stuff publicly. And I will say to people out there, you know, be really cautious about coming out and talking about this stuff. At the same time, I have had almost no pushback. Like I have had almost no negative experiences. The negative experiences I've had connected to me coming forward are so minimal. It's maybe an eye roll every once in a while from someone, but I don't know what people are saying behind my back, but no one has said anything negative really of any meaningful way to my face. So the times have changed. And so I've come forward with this stuff with almost zero backlash.
Last question, and then we'll wrap it up. Or sort of like a two-part question. What do you think, if any, and you're speculating, is there a main message behind all this stuff, paranormal stuff that's happening? And the other thing is, what are you working on, and in regards to what's coming up next for you?
So the main message, like I've had to boil this down because you can kind of say, oh, like it's an environmental message, or it's our spirituality hasn't kept up with our technology. But so the main message is, for me, and because I've had to boil this down, like because there's like a lot of little messages that you can kind of so I would say the main message is that there is a deeper reality beyond this reality here. Like this reality here with the hard table and the clock ticking 1 second at a time, there's something grander just beyond our available perception. And that, I mean, that's where you get the question of what is God, what's our purpose?
It's almost like you've stolen Jacques Vallée's message. It's a giant kabuki theater, and the only message is we're not alone, that something's going on.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's once again, I can't understand the agenda of the people behind like the grand chess player, the kabuki theater puppeteer. But I can say that something's happening.
Yeah.
And then maybe when we die, we'll be enlightened and we'll understand it all, or so. But for now, we're stuck here. We can tickle the corners of it, but we'll never know it completely. So
I think, do you see it like a Super Bowl like I do? Like, I always say most of the world lives in lives of quiet desperation, and you and I got to play in the Super Bowl. Like this, if you understand this is the wildest thing that you could possibly be doing.
Yeah, I think about it, and at the same time, it's like you still gotta put gas in the gas tank, and like you still gotta do the dullest stuff. You gotta, we're still burdened by the absolutely pragmatic stuff that you're required to do to be a person. So, but at the same time, like I marvel and I just am so grateful for that this invaded my life, because it has allowed me to, I basically open my email inbox and am just confronted with magic. Magic comes spilling out in not every email, but a lot, like that's what, most people aren't calling me by the phone. And sometimes you go to a conference and people talk to you. It's the same thing. You interact with someone, this magic spills out. Just tonight, just talking here and hearing what little I heard from, I didn't know anything about the other folks that are here on the show, like, Nicole and Sinead, and I knew a little bit about Desta, but this is, like, we're not alone. This is powerful stuff, and it feels great to share it.
Beautiful. And what are you doing now? What's new for Mike? What's going to be coming from you?
I've got a couple little projects going. One of them is I started a novel a while ago, and I kind of put it on hold, and I'm like, feel like I got to finish it. It'll be a short novel, but I feel like I got to finish that. And I've been trying to promote the audiobooks and stuff like that. There's a third audiobook, so I'll have all three books and 3 audiobooks. The third, they'll all be as audiobooks soon. There's one final one that needs to go up there, which was actually the first one, which is the longest book, and that will be coming up online soon.
Beautiful. I absolutely appreciate your coming on, and we can do it again. I maintain you are maybe the best storyteller in ufology. I just like you just and a wonderful way of telling it. So I want to thank you for joining us, and hopefully you can join me on this next little thing at the end of the week. It's like a half-hour thing, but it's a pretty big audience. Hopefully I can help you get your message out, and
great.
We can share stuff and try to unravel this thing, or just at least get entertained by what we're doing. So thanks a lot. And thank you to Sinead and to Nicole and to Desta, who's in the background taping. And are you going to be at any conferences this year we may run into you?
You know, everything with the COVID stuff, it's all kind of shut down and stuff like that. There was one that in Michigan, the Michigan UFO Con, which is usually around September in Knockwood. Hopefully the
Yeah.
global situation will settle down enough in the upcoming months, so I'll be able to attend that. So
Beautiful. Okay, hopefully we see you down the road. Thank you, Mike, and thank you to everybody for being a part of this.
you're very welcome.
Thank you,
It was great meeting
everybody.
everyone else too.
Pleasure.
So
It's nice to meet you
Everybody.
too.
Thank you.